The crystal glass did not simply shatter, it froze midair for a fraction of a second before collapsing into glittering dust, and the entire luxury restaurant fell into stunned silence. Inside Veloria Grand, where politicians, billionaires, and hidden supernatural elites paid fortunes for privacy, fear spread faster than sound. At the center of the destruction stood a small boy in an expensive navy blazer, his pale face streaked with tears, his chest rising with uneven breaths that carried something far colder than anger. He was Leon Viren, the only son of the Vampire King. Another glass flew from his hand and struck a marble pillar, disintegrating into frost-like shards as a wave of unnatural winter rolled across the room, extinguishing candle flames and making grown men instinctively step back. The boy's grief pressed against the air like a storm barely contained. "He promised," Leon cried, his voice cracking not with fury, but with heartbreak. "He always promises." Waiters froze, guests whispered, and the manager whispered sharp instructions about silence and discretion, terrified of the Viren name. No one dared approach the air of darkness. No one except one quiet waitress who had spent her life being unseen. Amara Wells had learned early that invisibility was survival. She worked double shifts to care for her grandmother, endured entitled insults without reaction, and built quiet walls around her heart. But when she looked at Leon, she did not see a prince or a monster. She saw a child drowning in abandonment. Slowly, deliberately, she set down her tray and stepped forward, ignoring the manager's warning hiss behind her. Each step toward the chaos felt like walking into a blizzard, yet she did not stop. Leon grabbed the tablecloth and yanked, sending plates crashing and silverware skidding across polished marble. Lights above him flickered violently. Still, Amara knelt a few feet away, close enough to be heard but far enough not to threaten. "I know your hearts," she said softly, her voice steady despite the cold stinging her skin. The boy froze mid-motion, shocked that someone spoke to him instead of about him. Tears continued to fall, but his breathing slowed slightly, as if her calm tone created space where panic once ruled. She did not command him to stop. She did not scold. She simply told him that breaking things sometimes feels easier than admitting we feel broken inside. The words landed. The glass slipped from his fingers. "My father doesn't want me," Leon whispered, the truth heavier than the shattered crystal around them. Amara's throat tightened, but she did not deny his feelings. She told him that powerful people often struggle to show love, not because they lack it, but because they fear vulnerability more than enemies. Silence followed, deep and fragile. Then she asked if he would help her clean the mess together. It was not an order. It was an invitation. After a long pause, Leon nodded slowly. Side by side, they began picking up the pieces, the Prince of Shadows and the invisible waitress kneeling on the same cold floor. That was the moment the temperature dropped again, not from Leon's powers, but from something far older entering the room. Conversations died completely. The doors at the far end opened without sound. Vampire King Masha's Viren stepped inside. He did not rush. He did not shout. His presence alone commanded stillness. Tall, composed, dressed in dark elegance that seemed woven from night itself, he surveyed the destruction before his gaze settled on the impossible sight. His son calm, kneeling beside a human girl who showed no fear. Leon noticed him and stiffened, shame replacing rage. But instead of running to his father, the boy instinctively moved closer to Amara, gripping the edge of her uniform as if she were safety. The smallest gesture changed everything. Masha's ancient eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation and something deeper he could not immediately name. For the first time in months, his son was not out of control. For the first time in years, someone had reached him without force. And the Vampire King was not watching the shattered glass. He was watching the human girl who had done what power never could. A journey from the ruined restaurant to the Viren estate unfolded in a silence so dense it felt almost physical. as if even the night itself understood it was carrying something fragile. The long black luxury car moved smoothly through rain-glossed streets, city lights sliding across its tinted windows like fading memories. Amara sat rigidly on one side of the back seat, her hands folded tightly, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Across from her sat Vampire King Mascius Viren, unmoving, his dark presence filling the space with controlled gravity. Between them lay Leon, exhausted from his emotional collapse, curled slightly against the leather seat. Amara should have been terrified. She had just been taken from her workplace by the most feared figure in the supernatural world, a ruler whispered about in courts and shadow alliances. Yet fear was not the only emotion inside her. Her strange empathy, something she had hidden all her life, kept feeding her impressions she could not ignore. From Leon came lingering sadness, shame, and a desperate need to feel safe. From Mascius came something colder, but heavier centuries of restraint, a will forged by power, and beneath it all a loneliness so deep it felt like standing at the edge of an endless winter. Halfway through the drive, Leon shifted in his sleep, his small body instinctively seeking warmth. His head slowly tilted sideways until it rested gently against Amara's thigh. She froze, unsure if she should move, afraid the king would object, but instinct overruled fear. Carefully, she placed her hand on Leon's hair in a soft, comforting gesture. The boy sighed in his sleep, his breathing evening out as his entire body relaxed. When Amara lifted her eyes, she found Mascius watching her. His gaze was sharp yet unreadable, not anger, not approval, but something searching. He said nothing, yet the silence between them shifted. For the first time, he looked not like an untouchable ruler, but like a father, witnessing a kind of comfort he did not know how to give. The city eventually faded behind them, replaced by mist-covered forests and long, isolated roads. Towering iron gates shaped like frozen branches opened silently as the car approached, revealing the Viren estate beyond. It was not a home, but a Gothic fortress of black stone rising from the earth, like something carved from night itself. No warm lights shone from its windows. No laughter echoed from its grounds. It was magnificent, but lifeless. Amara stepped out hesitantly, the cold forest air brushing her skin. Leon, now awake, instinctively reached for her hand before even glancing at his father. The small gesture did not go unnoticed. Inside, the grand foyer stretched vast and silent, its polished marble reflecting the dim antler-shaped chandelier overhead. The air smelled faintly of old stone and metal, like history preserved rather than lived. Mascius ordered a guest chamber prepared for her, his voice echoing through the cavernous hall. But before the command could fully settle, Leon tightened his grip on her hand. His voice, small but urgent, insisted she see his room first. The request carried fear beneath excitement, as if he needed her to understand his world before she disappeared from it. Mascius studied their joined hands for a long moment, conflict flickering behind his controlled expression. Finally, he gave a small nod of permission. Leon led her eagerly up the winding staircase, past towering portraits of pale ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow their movement. The higher they climbed, the more Amara felt the mansion's cold emptiness soften slightly. When Leon pushed open his bedroom doors, she stopped in quiet surprise. Unlike the rest of the estate, his room was filled with color and warmth. The walls were painted sky blue, stars scattered across the ceiling like a child's private galaxy. Shelves overflowed with books, toys, and art supplies. A large table stood covered in drawings, crayons, and half-finished paintings. It was the only place in the entire fortress that felt alive. Leon proudly showed her everything, his favorite truck, his books, his art desks, small glimpses of the boy hidden beneath the title of heir. Then he led her to a drawing taped carefully on the wall. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun. He pointed at the smallest one and said it was him. Then he pointed at the tallest figure, his father. His voice softened as he admitted he drew it after his mother left, because he hoped one day his father would stand close enough to hold his hand for real. Amara felt her chest tighten. Neither of them noticed the silent figure standing in the doorway. Shadow Masha's had returned, watching the scene unfold. And for the first time in centuries, the vampire king felt something shift inside him. Not power, not dominance, but the quiet awakening of a heart he thought long buried. Morning inside the Viren estate arrived without warmth, only a pale silver light filtering through towering Gothic windows as mist clung to the ancient forest beyond the walls. Amara woke slowly in the vast guest chamber prepared for her, the velvet drapes and obsidian floors reflecting candlelight in quiet stillness. For a moment, she wondered if the previous night had been a dream. The shattered restaurant, the silent king, the lonely child, but the weight of the estate's atmosphere confirmed it was all real. As she stepped into the corridor, a servant guided her toward the dining hall, though the mansion itself felt eerily empty, as if shadows performed most of its duties. When she entered the grand hall, Leon was already seated at the far end of the long table, his small frame barely visible behind towering silver arrangements. The moment he saw her, his face lit with relief so genuine it erased the coldness of the room. He climbed down from his chair and hurried toward her, instinctively taking her hand, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Servants exchanged quiet glances, surprised at the prince's attachment to a human guest. Moments later, the air shifted. Without announcement, Vampire King Masha's Viren entered the hall. His presence lowered the temperature by degrees, his movements silent yet commanding. Amara felt the pressure of his aura before he even reached the table. Leon's grip on her hand tightened, not out of fear, but from wanting her to remain beside him. Breakfast unfolded in formal silence. Leon spoke softly about the books he wanted to read with her and the garden he wished to show her later, his voice lighter than it had been in the restaurant. Masha's listened without interruption, though his eyes occasionally flickered toward Amara, not hostile, but observant, as if studying an unfamiliar force. When Leon excused himself to retrieve a drawing he wanted to show her, the vast hall fell still. Masha's finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. He asked why she had approached his son when everyone else retreated. Amara answered honestly. She said she did not see royalty or danger, only a child hurting. She admitted she understood loneliness well enough to recognize it, even in someone powerful. For a brief second, something unreadable crossed the king's expression, recognition buried beneath centuries of restraint. He revealed that Leon's mother had left years ago, unable to bear the weight of royal life. And since then Leon's emotions had grown unstable, his powers reacting to every wound he could not express. Tutors had failed. Guardians feared him. No one could reach him without triggering his defenses. Until her. Machaz did not thank her, but the absence of dismissal carried quiet respect. Days passed, and Amara remained at the estate at Leon's quiet insistence. What began as temporary presence evolved into daily companionship. She read stories beside him, painted at his art table, and listened when he spoke about missing normal childhood things he could never have. His powers, once volatile, became calmer the more emotionally secure he felt. Laughter, rare in the fortress, began echoing faintly through upper corridors. Even the servants moved with less tension. Masha's observed all of it from a distance. He never interfered, yet he was always aware. What unsettled him most was not her influence on Leon, but her influence on the atmosphere itself. She did not tremble in his presence the way others did. She treated him with respectful calm rather than fear. One evening, after Leon fell asleep during a reading session, Amara stepped onto a balcony overlooking the moonlit forest. The night air was cold, yet peaceful. She sensed Machaz before she heard him. He stood beside her, silent for a long moment. He asked if she feared him now that she knew what he truly was. She answered softly that power never frightened her, only cruelty did. And she had seen none directed at his son. The words lingered between them, dissolving a layer of distance neither acknowledged aloud. For the first time in centuries, the vampire king felt seen not as a ruler or predator, but as a father trying, imperfectly, to protect what remained of his family. And in that quiet exchange beneath the moon, something fragile began forming, not romance yet, but the foundation of trust strong enough to reshape the destiny of both their worlds. The fragile warmth that had begun to grow inside the Viren estate did not remain hidden for long, because power, especially vampire royal power, was never left unwatched. Rivals, ancient covens, and political enemies constantly searched for weakness within royal bloodlines, and Leon's emotional instability had long been considered the Viren throne's greatest vulnerability. One cold twilight evening, the estate's ancient protective wards flickered for the first time in decades, sending a ripple of tension through the fortress. Amara felt the disturbance before alarms echoed across the halls. The air tightened, heavy with hostile intent. Servants moved swiftly to secure lower wings, while shadow guards took silent defensive positions. Leon, who had been painting beside her, suddenly froze. Fear radiated from him like frost spreading across glass. His powers reacted instinctively, the temperature dropping as ice formed along the windows. He didn't fully understand the danger, but he felt it deeply. Amara immediately knelt beside him, steadying his trembling hands and guiding his breathing the way she had during his nightmares. She spoke calmly, grounding him, reminding him he was safe. Slowly, the frost receded, his breathing steadied, and the surge subsided. Moments later, the doors opened and Vampire King Mash's Viren entered, his aura darker than she had ever sensed, controlled fury contained beneath regal composure. He informed her briefly that rival forces had tested the estate's defenses, probing for access to the heir. Leon's instability made him a political target, and tonight's disturbance had not been accidental. It was then Amara realized Leon's emotional healing was not just personal, it was protection against enemies who would exploit his pain. Security across the estate intensified after that night, but something else shifted within Machelis. He began involving Amara more directly, not through formal command, but through quiet trust. He asked her to remain near Leon during council gatherings and periods of political tension, knowing her presence stabilized the boy's emotions. She agreed without hesitation. Over the following days, Amara witnessed another side of the Vampire King One few outside royal circles ever saw. She saw the sleepless strategist, standing alone in war chambers, studying alliances and threats that stretched across continents. She saw the father who paused outside Leon's door before entering, as if unsure how to cross emotional distances power could not conquer. One evening Leon wandered into the council chamber searching for him. Guards hesitated, but allowed the interruption. Amara followed quietly. The boy approached the massive war table where Masha stood reviewing reports. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Leon asked softly if the bad people wanted to hurt him. The innocence of the question cut deeper than political threat. Mashas lowered himself to one knee, a gesture no council member had ever witnessed, and assured his son that no force in existence would ever take him away. The promise was calm, absolute, unshaken. Leon hugged him tightly, and after a brief hesitation, Mayes returned the embrace. Amara watched silently, realizing that the king's coldness had never been absence of love. It had been fear of failing to protect what he loved most. However, peace did not last. One storm-lashed night, the estate's defenses were breached, not fully, but enough to allow shadow assassins from a rival coven to infiltrate the outer corridors. Their objective was precise: destabilize the heir. The attack was swift and silent, clashing steel and supernatural force echoing through distant halls. Amara had been reading Leon a story when the lights dimmed unnaturally. She sensed danger immediately. Leon's fear surged. frost creeping across the walls as his power reacted. Instead of panicking, she grounded him again, holding his hands and guiding his focus. She reminded him he was stronger than his fear. When assassins reached the outer chamber, they found not chaos, but calm. Guards eliminated the threat moments later, but the real victory had already been secured. Leon had remained emotionally stable, denying the attackers the reaction they sought. When Masha's arrived and saw his son asleep beside Amara, still clutching her sleeve for comfort, something profound settled inside him. He realized her presence was not temporary aid. It was protection beyond physical guards. Later, in the silent grand hall, he thanked her not as a king issuing formal gratitude, but as a father acknowledging someone who had helped save his child's life. And in that moment, trust between them deepened, forged not through power or politics, but through shared devotion to the same fragile heart. After the failed infiltration, the Viren estate changed in ways that could not be measured by stronger guards or thicker wards. The change was quieter, deeper, rooted in trust. Leon no longer flinched at distant sounds in the corridor. He no longer feared that every shadow carried danger. Instead, he walked the halls with steadier steps, often holding Amara's hand, not out of desperation, but out of comfort. His powers, once unpredictable, responded to his emotions with balance. Frost no longer crept across walls without warning. The servants noticed the difference. The council noticed the difference. And most of all, Masha's noticed the difference. He began requesting Amara's presence, not only during Leon's lessons, but during strategic meetings where the heir's composure mattered politically. It was not a formal declaration, but it was unmistakable acknowledgement that her role had grown beyond caretaker. Yet the supernatural world was not kind to change, especially when that change involved a human standing near a royal throne. Whispers began circulating among allied bloodlines. Questions surfaced quietly. Why was a human influencing the heir? Was the king compromising tradition? Was the throne weakening? The murmurs reached the council chambers soon enough. During a formal gathering of ancient vampire nobles, one elder openly questioned whether emotional reliance on a human posed a long-term risk to the royal lineage. A chamber fell silent, every eye shifting toward Machus. His response was calm, measured, and unwavering. He stated that strength was defined by stability, not by isolation, and that Leon's growth proved the value of what had been introduced into their world. It was not a defensive statement, it was a declaration. No further challenge followed. Still, the pressure lingered. Leon sensed it in subtle ways. He overheard fragments of conversations, felt the tension in council sessions, and quietly asked Amara one evening if she would ever leave because of it. The question carried fear, but not the desperate panic he once felt. Amara answered honestly. She told him she would not disappear without explanation. She told him that love, whether family or chosen, meant staying through difficulty, not fleeing from it. The reassurance settled him, but the conversation reached Makaz as well. Later that night, he approached her in the estate gardens where moonlit flowers glowed faintly against the dark stone. He did not question her loyalty. Instead, he acknowledged the burden she carried by remaining near the throne. He told her that the council's doubts were not about her worth, but about tradition resisting evolution. For centuries, vampire royalty had relied on fear to maintain order. Compassion had rarely been considered an asset. Amara replied that fear might command obedience, but it could never inspire trust. The statement lingered in the cold night air. Machus had ruled through calculated control his entire existence, yet her presence had introduced something stronger than fear-loyalty born from respect. As winter deepened, the estate prepared for the Crimson Conclave, an annual gathering where supernatural leaders reinforced alliances and assessed the stability of royal bloodlines. Leon's participation was mandatory. It would be the first time many nobles observed him publicly, since his emotional volatility had become known. The pressure was immense. Enemies hoped for instability. allies watched for weakness. Amara stood beside him not as a shield, but as quiet support. When the conclave began, the grand hall filled with ancient figures draped in dark elegance, their eyes sharp with centuries of judgment. Leon stood at his father's side, calm and composed. When questioned about the recent infiltration attempt, he answered clearly, without fear or power surge. His aura remained steady. The hall felt it. The nobles felt it. Even rival observers could not deny the transformation. Later, as music played softly across the marble floor, Leon laughed lightly at something Amara whispered to ease his nerves. The sound, small but genuine, echoed through a chamber long accustomed to tension. It was the clearest proof of all. Near midnight, as the conclave concluded successfully, Leon grew tired and leaned against Amara's shoulder, drifting to sleep peacefully despite the crowd. Marchose approached and gently lifted his son into his arms. Instead of immediately retreating, he paused beside her. His voice was low, meant only for her. He acknowledged that she had altered the future of his bloodline, not through supernatural strength, but through emotional courage. He admitted that centuries of power had never solved what simple kindness had healed. For the first time, there was no distance in his gaze, not ruler to subject, not vampire to human, but two guardians who had protected the same child from different forms of darkness. And in that shared understanding, something steady and undeniable began to grow between them, not declared, not rushed, but powerful enough to challenge tradition itself. The days following the Crimson Conclave carried a different atmosphere within the Viren estate, one no longer ruled purely by shadow or silence, but by a fragile balance that had been earned rather than commanded. Leon's transformation was now undeniable to every council member, every guard, and every rival who had once whispered about instability within the royal bloodline. He walked the halls with calm confidence, his powers no longer reacting to fear, but responding to emotional clarity he had learned through patience and trust. Yet while his strength had grown, Amara understood something quietly difficult. Her place within this immortal world had never been formally defined. She had come as a waitress who showed kindness to a broken child. She had stayed as his emotional anchor. But the future required clarity. One evening she asked to speak privately with Machis in the grand library, where ancient books lined the walls and candlelight reflected softly across polished obsidian floors. She spoke honestly, without hesitation, explaining that she could not remain indefinitely without understanding her place in their world. She did not seek status or royal privilege. She only wanted purpose rooted in truth rather than circumstance. Machis listened without interruption, his posture composed yet attentive. When she finished, he did not respond immediately. Instead, he asked her a question no one expected from a king. What did she want her place to be? The simplicity of the question unsettled her more than any command could. Before she could answer fully, events beyond the estate forced resolution. A rival coven, unable to destabilize Leon through direct attack, turned to political manipulation. Rumors spread through supernatural networks, claiming the heir's stability depended entirely on a fragile human presence, suggesting the Viren throne had grown vulnerable. Such whispers, if believed, could fracture alliances. The council convened urgently, and the accusations were raised openly before allied leaders. Eyes turned toward Leon, measuring his composure. If he faltered, the rumors would gain power. If he remained steady, they would collapse. Amara stood at the chamber's edge, refusing to retreat despite the scrutiny. Before Marchose could speak, Leon stepped forward on his own. His voice was clear, steady beyond his years. He explained that while Amara had helped him understand his emotions, his strength now came from what he had learned, not from dependence. He spoke about how kindness had taught him control, how trust had replaced fear, and how leadership required emotional clarity, not isolation. As he finished, his aura remained perfectly balanced. No frost, no surge, only calm power. The chamber fell silent. The accusation dissolved instantly. Even rival observers could not deny the proof standing before them. Mashas did not silence opposition with threat. He let his son's strength speak for itself. After the council dispersed, Mashas found Amara standing alone in the moonlit corridor beyond the chamber. Pride rested quietly in his expression, not only in Leon's composure, but in the path that had made it possible. He told her she had given his son something no royal training could provide, a foundation built on compassion rather than fear. He acknowledged that centuries of power had never solved what her presence had healed. They moved to the balcony overlooking the endless forest, the same place where many unspoken truths had passed between them. There, Mashas spoke openly for the first time, not as a ruler addressing a subject, but as a man confronting his own transformation. He admitted that protecting his bloodline had always been his greatest duty, yet somewhere between defending her place in his world and watching her reshape his son's future, he had begun to care for her beyond obligation. It was not a dramatic confession, but a quiet, powerful truth. Amara answered with equal honesty. She said she had never feared his darkness, only the idea of becoming invisible again. In response, he made a promise not of crowns or titles, but of presence. In his world, she would never be unseen. In the months that followed, the Viren estate transformed fully. It no longer stood as a fortress of isolation, but as a living home where power and compassion coexisted. Amara chose to remain not as servant, not as guest, but as a partner in shaping the emotional future of the heir. Leon thrived, growing into a leader who understood that true strength required empathy as much as authority. A vampire king, once feared as untouchable, now ruled with a balance that strengthened rather than weakened his throne. And the story that began with shattered crystal inside a luxury restaurant became legend not because of destruction, but because one act of quiet human kindness had healed a royal bloodline that power alone never could.